Few events in modern history have cut more deeply into our awareness than 9/11. It was unexpected, it was huge, not only in the casualty count, but in the property damage and the disruption of the normal functions of life that are inexorably tied in one way or another to what's going on Wall Street, about air travel and the events around. Every time huge crowds gather in a small space for sporting events or anything else, it just changed the way we think. Now, we'd all heard of terrorist attacks that had been blamed on Islamic groups, but I dare say that previous to 9/11, that all the other terrorist attacks that had happened around the world hardly left muddy footprints on the clean waxed floor of our memories. Prior to 9/11, there were not very many Americans that could even begin to tell you the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims. And in fact, some anti-Islamic Americans have literally attacked Hindu Sikhs, assuming that these Hindus were Muslims. And you're smart people, you wouldn't be here if you weren't. But if I ask you which of these men is a Muslim and which is a Hindu, not all of you would answer correctly. And if I have to tell you which is which, doesn't that make it obvious that it doesn't matter? It's entirely understandable that people were casting about for some immediate way to get their hands around 9/11. And as usually happens when people look for quick and easy answers to complicated issues, almost every conclusion reached was wrong, especially the conclusions offered by the media. There is no inherent East-West cultural war. There simply is not by nature a violent religion. Islam, Christianity, Judaism can all be twisted and abused into becoming a violent religion, but Islam is not inherently a violent religion. And the Arab world does not hate us for our freedoms. It's just not true. And even some of the more sophisticated explanations didn't hold water for long. One of my best friends is a longtime military strategist and one of the best informed people that I know, a constant reader and thinker and consumer of news. But he said several times, I've never seen a terrorist who had a good career. Until, of course, we began to see a terrorist that had a good career. Or I never see a terrorist that had a good education until we find college-educated terrorists. We've even said, why is it always young men? There's never women involved in terrorism until we find suicide bombers who are women. It was persuasive, and it was persuasive enough that there are international groups that have spent a great deal of time and effort, and not a small amount of money, trying to stem the tide of extremist recruitment through jobs programs. But economic issues have turned out to be a very poor predictor of who is the most likely to become radicalized and become an active terrorist. President Obama observed just a couple of years ago that poverty alone does not cause a person to become a terrorist, any more than poverty alone causes someone to become a criminal. You can certainly see that poorer neighborhoods have higher rates of crime, but there's a world of very poor people who do not become violent and who do not become criminals. There are very real cultural reasons for terrorism, but because the actual number of terrorists is so small, it's very difficult to diagnose. 99.99% of Muslims not only are not violent, they are not sympathetic with violence. Mercy Corps researchers interviewed a 23-year-old former militant fighter who told them, I did not join the Taliban because I was poor. I joined because I was angry. Until we are willing to understand the anger that is real in the Arab world about centuries of colonialism and cultural oppression and domination, we will never understand the attraction that some Muslims are feeling towards militant resistance. It's been interesting to me to watch the Bill Maher and Reza Aslan debate. Bill Maher is a fairly literate comic. As comics go, he's a pretty well-informed and insightful guy. Reza Aslan, in spite of being a Harvard-educated guy, is, to me, a fairly dubious religious scholar. I think Aslan plays kind of fast and loose with the facts in his writing, which is part of what makes him so popular. I think you're almost guaranteed to not sell many books if you're really factual about your books. But Bill raises the very real point that while the terrorists are few, really few, there's way too much sympathy in the Islamic world for what the terrorists do. And Reza Aslan counters that Bill is totally misreading the level of sympathy that exists for terrorists in the Muslim community. But I think Bill is guilty of a certain degree of Islamophobia, but I also think that Reza is being something of a propagandist. He's saying what he wishes was true more than he says what is actually true. It's nothing short of insane, and I don't use that word loosely. It is nothing short of insane to blame all or even a large segment of Islam for the acts of a very small number of terrorists. But you cannot be honest and not acknowledge that there are dangerous elements in Islam that need to be corrected. There are extremist elements in the history of all world religions. Christianity is certainly vulnerable to being manipulated in the hands of violent extremists. But we can name examples of the same thing among Jewish adherents, among Buddhists even, and among Hindus. Now, I'm going to try to treat that issue of the need for religious reform in all the major world religions next week, which is in and of itself an act of faith that you will not only remember what I'm saying today after you've left our parking lot, but that you'll actually be able to connect this message to the one that you'll hear next week. But I'm a minister, so I still partially believe in miracles. It could happen. No rational discussion of terrorism can fail to acknowledge that the majority of 21st century terrorists claim an identification with Islam. The names of terrorist organizations they're just named in the news, and the names just roll across our awareness. But we hear references to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, al-Nusra, and al-Shabaab, and we simply assume that what they all have in common is Islam. But that seriously makes no more sense than saying that Catholics and Presbyterians are of the same cloth as paramilitary Christian fanatics that attack gays and minority people around our country. The uncomfortable truth that neither our government nor our media really wants to look at is that there is an identifiable movement within Islam, known as Salafism, that is insanely dogmatic, it's puritanical, it's misogynistic, and it is violent. And if you hear Salafism mentioned, if you hear it at all, it's usually called Wahhabism, after the name of their founder, bin Abdul Wahhab. He was an 18th century Sunni who lived in Saudi Arabia, and he became so extreme in his faith that he equated being Christian or Jew as being a sorcerer, which meant you were subject to execution. But he was a Sunni, which when I was in graduate school, I was told that Sunnis were pacifistic. But he said that all Shia were heretics, deserving of death. And in fact, in Wahhabism, for a Wahhabi to kill a Shia is a guaranteed entrance into heaven. All of the terrorist groups you hear about from Muslim groups are the fruit from seeds of these Salafists. But it's nearly impossible to address this violent form of Islamic extremism because it is rooted in, it is funded by, and it is taught in and protected by oil-rich Saudi Arabia. An Islamic scholar, Saeed Mahid Matarasi, and I hope he's not listening because I'm pretty sure that's not the correct pronunciation. But he wrote, "Yet having witnessed the horrors associated with militant fanaticism, Western governments remain unashamedly deferential to the oligarchs in Riyadh and the West's foremost allies in the Arab world. Mercenary and duplicitous to the core, the Saudi political establishment has been subsidizing the Salafists with oil money, providing them with the freedom to spread their venomous hate across the globe." Now, as horrifying as the news reports of ISIS beheading of hostages has been, what is hardly mentioned, we've had, I think now, 7 journalists beheaded by ISIS. But in Saudi Arabia, they have more than 150 beheadings every year. The violent form of execution used in Saudi Arabia is so much a part of their identity that their flag are 2 crossed swords. Is to cross swords. It's the symbol of who they are and how they understand themselves. But American presidents visit the rulers of this violent nation, and not just the birthplace of, but also the financial center of Wahhabi extremism. And whether it's George W. Bush or Obama or Trump, they bow. They hold hands with the oligarchs. They praise them for their leadership in the region that they are daily poisoning with their sick view of Islam. During President Donald Trump's recent visit to Saudi Arabia, he praised what he called this magnificent kingdom and the grandeur of this remarkable place. And as if all the bowing and hand-holding and close conversation didn't already say it, he spelled it out for them that their horrible human rights abuses would not be an issue for his administration. He said literally this: "We are not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, who to be, or how to worship." He may as well have said, "Let the beheadings commence." Now, terrorists attack the United States, France, Belgium, England, and Germany for their own reasons. But the terrorists play a role for the governments where the attacks take place. Fear of a common enemy is the single most uniting tool that any government has to control their populations and to consolidate their power. And I don't want to be right about this, but in a prophetic intonation, an American president has the right to take a first strike launch on their command. And anytime a president is flagging in the polls, is embarrassed, is looking like they're about to get in trouble, the card they can play — I refuse to say the Trump card, that adjective doesn't get to be used anymore — but the card they can always play is to attack someone. And a full-out attack on North Korea or Iran could absolutely stem the tide of the negative view of the Trump administration. And I fear, I don't want to say he's going to do it, but I fear before articles of impeachment are filed that he will play that card. Now, in the wake of 9/11, the Bush administration created the Department of Homeland Security. And this behemoth of government agencies now spends more than $40 billion every year to protect us from terrorists. Now, this is entirely new. That agency didn't exist until 9/11. We didn't leave it to the CIA or the FBI or the Defense Department. We created a new $40 billion agency that is second only to the Department of Defense and Veterans Administration in our budget. And as I've previously mentioned, all of this is military spending. We are now in a wartime federal budget, even though we're not really engaged in an all-out war anywhere. In this age of Twitter, let me turn to one of my favorite sources of rational analysis. Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson to help us get this reaction to terrorism into perspective. Even including the most lethal terrorist act in history, which was 9/11, when more than 3,000 Americans were killed, still from that day to today, 17 years later, the total number of deaths has been 3,400 from terrorism, which is about how many Americans are killed every 4 or 5 weeks from gun owners in the United States. Since 9/11, on average, terrorists can be blamed for about 30 deaths of Americans every year. 30. $40 billion a year, 30 deaths. That is about 25% less than are killed by dogs. Folks, it's only slightly more than the number of Americans that are killed every year by dairy cows. 30,000 people were killed domestically with privately owned guns last year. Heck, 40 people were shot by toddlers with guns. Where, then, you may reasonably ask, is the government agency that protects us from dogs? Where is the Department of Dairy Cow Protection? Who is protecting us from pistol-slinging toddlers? Obviously, it would be absurd to have an agency to protect us from such matters, but it's not nearly as absurd as not having an active government intervention into the real source of terroristic threat to Americans, which is our neighbors who have guns. This isn't hard math. 30 deaths per year from terrorists, 32,000 from gun owners. The private gun owners of America are more than 1,000 times as dangerous as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, al-Nusra, and the Taliban combined. And yet the NRA is allowed to control our state and federal legislatures with political donations, donations that literally flow into our state houses and into our Congress on a river of American blood. We spend $40 billion to protect us from terrorists. We close our borders to Muslims. We build a wall between us and Mexico. We refuse even to allow refugees from war to come here. And yet Congress has made it illegal for the Center for Disease Control to even keep records of gun deaths in America. They will not allow state-funded universities to do research into gun safety, and they will not discuss more rational gun safety laws. The media wants you to be afraid of ISIS, but the people who are 1,000 times more likely to cause your death is your Congress, the NRA, and quite likely your crazy uncle. In the course of writing this book about what it would take to make America great, it's easy to be incredulous about why America does not have universal health care when every other Western democracy does. It's easy to be made numb thinking about the absurdity of our military spending, our dearth of meaningful gun laws, our inexplicable problems of poverty, obesity, hunger, and diabetes in the richest and the most agriculturally advanced nation in the world. We stand seemingly powerless in the face of the fairly obvious need to change from coal and oil to renewable forms of energy. Now, why, you might wonder, if a Midwestern corpulent cleric can outline the solutions to these problems, why then can't the combined genius of our Congress, our Senate, our executive branch, along with our remarkable universities and our corporate research facilities, why can't they get past these obvious hurdles? There is a unifying factor, and it's not nearly as evil as Wahhabism, nor as mysterious as physics. Democracy in the United States accidentally evolved into a two-party system, and both political parties derive all of their funding from political donations. 200 years ago, we had no idea how powerful those donations could become, and by the time it was evident, mere voters were in no position to prevent lobbyists and huge corporate interests from controlling the political system, shaping it to serve their own bottom line rather than serving the interests of the people. Now, this will be a topic for another day, but as boring as it sounds on the surface, campaign finance reform is the single most necessary change needed to set America free from its bondage to political donations from the special interests that have prevented America from emerging into the 21st century. Amen. Muslims are not your enemies. Terrorists only have power if you decide to give them power by being terrorized. There are ways to meaningfully address the real root causes of terrorism, but right now we are sending the home office of terrorism trillions of dollars a year, every year, and we all participate in this every time we fill up our cars with gasoline. We can stop funding radical terrorists when we have restored sanity to our government, which means that we have to address their lethal addiction to political donations. In the meantime, all I can tell you is to watch out for dairy cows because they can kill you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.